Good evening. My name is Darryl Robert Schoon, and my last program I talked about the genesis of what we call capitalism, which is basically modern banking using debt-based capital as money in place of savings-based capital. What happened in England was extraordinary. It changed the world. Previous to England's experiment with modern banking, with debt-based money, money was gold and silver, it was savings-based money. But the English were able to turn the world of money upside down on its head. And the reason they did so was that the bankers lived by charging interest. And getting the permission of the King of England to issue the money of England in terms of debt, all money out of England became debt. It was issued as debt in terms of loans. Now, what this did is they put the bankers in an enviable position. It didn't matter who they loaned money to as long as, one, they were paid back, and two, they made interest on it. And as long as this happened, they were happy. But the only way they can ensure that this would happen is to have the backing of the government, because only a government could say these pieces of paper, now based on debt, were real money. And they got a foothold in England in 1695. Within the next 150 years, this advantage made England the world's greatest empire since Rome. England was the only country in the world that was able to go to war on debt, on credit. Wars are very expensive. The British Navy was incredibly expensive to maintain. And as long as the British Navy could go across the rest of the world and take over countries and bring the wealth back to England, foisting their money onto those countries, and the bankers made money from that process, England was happy, so were the bankers. Now, what happened is the first trouble happened in the 1850s when England's empire stopped expanding. Now, as long as the empire expanded, it could take care of those compounding debts that debt-based money produces. And when the empire stopped expanding, this put the risk of the British Empire and the British banking system at risk. So over the next 50 years, Britain's empire started to decline, and so did the fortune of the bankers. Now, the bankers had made huge amounts of money in this century and a half, and they weren't about to give up a good deal. And so what they did was they took this concept of central banking and brought it to the United States. Now, America had resisted central banking since the beginning. Thomas Jefferson considered central banks probably the greatest threat to the American experiment, even greater than what he called standing armies. Jefferson believed that if you had a standing army, if you had an army waiting at the ready to go to war, you would end up bankrupt, because they're so paranoid of any possible enemies. He said the cost of maintaining a standing army will bankrupt the country far before a real enemy appears. So he knew the danger of a standing army. And he said central banking poses a greater threat to the American experiment than even does standing armies. He said, because if we allow private bankers to issue our currency, Americans will become debtors on their own land, homeless on the lands that they conquered. And he said this in the early 1800s, late 17th century. And the bankers weren't about to be put off. They knew how much money this was. So they, in around the early 19th century, they pushed through America's first central bank called the Bank of the United States. General Andrew Jackson was elected on a platform of throwing the bankers out. And he did. He promised, if I am elected, I am going to throw the Bank of the United States out of this country. And he did. So he stopped central banking. We didn't have a central bank in the United States. We had a series of state-chartered banks. We had gold and silver as money. And this sufficed until the year 1913. This is the year that the European bankers decided to make their move in the United States, to take their failing system, their flagging system of credit and debt based on debt-based money, transfer it from the Bank of England to the United States. And they did this on December 23rd, 2 days before Christmas. Very few people were in the House voting. Almost everybody gone on vacation. And they pushed this heinous act through. Not only did they push the Federal Reserve Act through that year, they also pushed through the first income tax in the United States. Why? Because they knew if we were going to have a federal reserve, a central bank issuing money to the government of the United States, the interest on that money that they loaned us, I mean, this is U.S. currency. Now the United States government was not going to print its own money. It was going to borrow this money from the Federal Reserve, which was not a part of the U.S. government. The Federal Reserve was a consortium of private banks that in the future were going to loan the United States money, charge the government interest on the United States dollars, and the United States was going to have to pay the interest on their own money. The bankers knew that unless we had a constant inflow of dollars, they weren't going to get paid. So they also put in that year the, I don't know what act it was, one of the amendments, legitimizing an income tax in the United States, which is illegal. Both these acts are unconstitutional and illegal. But it doesn't matter where power is concerned. Power determines what's legal and what's not. And the powers that were in the United States, banking and industry, were as powerful then as almost as they are now. They're even more powerful now. So that year we got not only the Federal Reserve, but we got the first national income tax. What happened was this. Very interesting. The British had babysit this idea of central banking for 200 years. It was the goose that laid the golden egg. When central banking came to England, England was this dinky little country sitting off the, northeast corner of France, heavily indebted, I mean, smaller than France, smaller than Germany, at war with the rest of the continent. That's all Europe was, a bunch of warring little fiefdoms. But with central banking and the ability to go to war on debt and on credit, within 150 years, within 200 years, England became the most powerful empire in the world. This is remarkable. Remarkable. So what happened is they took a carbon copy of the Bank of England in the middle of the night. They slipped it past the United States government. They basically conned Woodrow Wilson into signing it. And shortly after he signed it, he said, I've done a terrible thing. I have done a terrible thing to my country. The credit in this country is now controlled by a small group of powerful men. This group of powerful men will in the future determine what happens to our country, not the Congress nor the President. This is how powerful the Federal Reserve was then and is gotten even more powerful today. But let me tell you something. When central banking came to the United States, it was spelled the beginning of the end. The United States had no experience with central banking before. And there is a great deal of difference between the mentality of the British, a very conservative, thoughtful, very, very dubious kind of people, very skeptical of change. And then the Americans, cowboys, go for broke. Let's take chances. Go for it. Let's leverage what we've got. So this goose comes to the United States in the form of the Federal Reserve Bank and starts issuing debt-based money. Credit, okay? All of a sudden, money starts flowing into the United States. Within 20 years, this excessive amount of credit started the biggest bubble in the world at that time, the Roaring '20s. All of a sudden, money was floating all over the United States. People were speculating, they were betting, they were buying railroad stocks, they were buying radio stocks. Things were skyrocketing. The future looked good. My God, did it look good. Everybody was getting rich. This was what the 20s were all about. Speculative capital issued by the central bank, the Federal Reserve, had fueled America's huge stock market bubble, the Roaring '20s. This bubble grew and grew and grew until 1929 when it exploded and crashed. This was the crash of '29. What happened in the crash of '29, you got to look at this, because that's why you and I and our country is in the position that it's in now. When a speculative bubble collapses, everybody is over-leveraged. Everybody's borrowed money. Everybody owns a house bigger than they could live in. Every business is expanding faster than it normally would expand. Everybody is out there on the come, taking this money, betting on the future, because the future is so good. You can bet on it, you can count on it, and it's coming. That's what bubbles do. They give you the idea that better days are here. Bet what you got today, because you're going to have a better tomorrow. When the bubble collapses, tomorrow's gone. It's dust. And what you're left with is the debts that you capitalized on the way up with your debt-based money. So in 1929, the bubble collapsed. By 1930-31, thousands of banks went broke, just belly up. People lost their savings, and America entered the first Great Depression. People owed so much money that they didn't know they couldn't get started again. The banks wouldn't issue credit. Why wouldn't the banks issue credit? Because in the 1920s, they gave credit to everybody who thought he was going to pay it back. When 1931 happened, the banks didn't think anyone was going to pay it back. I mean, these are the guys that used to hand it out like candy in 1928. You want to buy stocks? Hey, take a tip from me. Buy Railroad, buy RCA. Here's, leverage this up. Here's some money. Go borrow on it. 1931, 32, you come in there to get a loan to keep your business together. Sorry, window's closed. We're not loaning money. This is what happened in the 1930s. They tried everything. They tried liquefying. They tried pouring more money in. That didn't work. They said, oh, holy smokes, we got to cut credit. We got to clean the system out. We got to get rid of all these old debts. They did that. That didn't work. By 1937, the U.S. stock market was worth 90% of what it was in 1928. 90%. If you had a $100,000 portfolio in the stocks in the Dow in 1928, by 1937, you had $10,000. And your portfolio was not going to recover to its original $100,000 until 1954. So don't tell me equities always go up. They're like everything else. What goes up comes down. All right? The people selling you your house aren't going to tell you that. The people selling you your stocks aren't going to tell you that. And the people who aren't selling you a life insurance policy aren't going to tell you that. Because they're taking your money and betting it on the come. So this is what happened in the 1930s. It was so dire, nobody had broken the system yet. The English had the system for 200 years, and they babied it. Certainly they had expansions. Certainly they had contractions. Certainly they had ups and downs, because that's what debt-based money from the central bank does. They put out credit, things expand, then all of a sudden they go too far, things start collapsing, they bring it back down, and then it cycles. Cycle, 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 cycle. What happened is when debt-based money came to the United States, America took this golden goose and we blew it up with a gas pump. This goose got huge. Bigger than it had ever been before. And when this goose blew up, there was feathers, there was guts, it was all over the place. No one could put that goose back together again. You couldn't even eat it. It was done. Now, how do we get out of this? Well, they elected FDR. He promised he was going to get them out of it. He didn't. He didn't. What he did do was he started taking some of that money and helping the absolute poor, people who were just stumbling along with no money, and he gave them some of that money back. So he kept America on a subsistence level, the people who were just totally at the edge, in breadlines. That's what he did. He didn't start it again. He didn't recreate the country. He didn't make capitalism come back. What saved capitalism was an entirely unexpected event. No one considered it. It wasn't tightening credit. It wasn't loosening credit. What it was over in Europe, Hitler decided to take over the world. And over in Japan, the Japanese decided, hey, let's take over this part. So you had fascism coming in over the rest of the world. All of a sudden, the United States, Europe, the rest of the world had a combine, get to the bone, cut everything down, go on a war footing, push their way back, and knocked out. And at the end of 1945, the world was in shambles. It was absolutely in shambles. Europe was destroyed, Asia was destroyed, and all the debts were destroyed. They were gone. I mean, in the past 10 years, people forgot about those damn debts. They weren't paid back anyway. We had to build bombs, we had to build carriers, we had to build airplanes. Everybody forgot it. They were washed out. We were starting with a clean slate. And not only were we starting with a clean slate, we had all this gold. What happened in the United States during the war, which nobody understood, was we built everybody's arms for them, and they paid for them with gold. So at the end of 1949, the United States had 75% of the world's gold. No country in the world ever had that amount of gold before. Not the percentage of the world's wealth. 75%. 21,775 metric tons of gold bullion sitting there in Fort Knox. All right? Fort Knox. What happened? Ah, you got to love this country. You got to love this country. After World War II, fascism was, it was exactly where it deserved to be. All right? And communism, you had Russia, just tatters of itself. I mean, millions died fighting Stalin. Fighting Hitler. Okay? The Chinese, they were just stumbling around. They had thrown out the the communists took over, threw out the bankers. They have no money. So communism posed no threat at all. Not economically. Maybe ideologically. Maybe to those paranoid bankers on Wall Street that were bound to stamp out the embers of this ideology that didn't like banking. All right? Those were the only boys that thought maybe that bankrupt country in Russia and China posed a threat to us. Well, let me tell you what happened. Thomas Jefferson was absolutely right. You put a paranoid in charge of the government. You put military in your government, you're going to go bankrupt. You're going to spend all your money on these fictitious enemies that are at your throat. Not that they don't want to do you in, but they can't do you in. And you end up doing yourself in. In 1949, the United States had 21,775 tons of monetary gold. Now, monetary gold is only traded between the countries to balance trade deficits. If England had excess dollars, they could go to our treasury, and for every dollar we had to give, for every $35 in dollars, we had to give them an ounce of gold. And we had 75% of the world's gold. We anchored the world economic system. Our dollar was based on gold. All other currency was based on us. We had stability, and that's the way it worked. For the next 20 years, the United States had a positive balance of trade. Which means the United States, we're the most powerful industrial country in the world, which means is that we sold more to the rest of the world than we bought from the rest of the world. We had a great economy. We were untouched by the 2 world wars. All right? And we were, this was the land of milk and honey. In the next 20 years, we had a positive balance of trade. So if we had started out with 21,775 tons of gold, we should have had maybe 25,000 tons at the end of 20 years, minimum. Maybe 30. Maybe we should have had 85% of the world's gold in our vaults by that time. Well, let me tell you. In 1971, when Nixon shut the gold window, the United States had at the most, 7,000 to 8,000 tons left. And we owed 34,000 tons more. There was so much money out there waiting to be redeemed from the United States for our gold we couldn't cover. So we shut the gold window. We're not going to give you any gold for this. To hell with you. And all of a sudden, all money became paper. Money, for the first time in history, had no gold or silver connection at all. Even the British, which tried for 200 years to maintain this, didn't blow it off. We did. We did. Why? Why did we spend all that gold? Because of the military. We had army bases, we had navy bases, we had air force bases, we littered the globe. We surrounded our enemies with a military might that showed them we weren't going to allow them into us. And you know what we did? We bankrupted our bank. We bankrupted our savings. And no one knew this. The government did. After 1954, they wouldn't allow an audit of our gold holdings. So when Nixon shut the gold window, it wasn't because of Social Security. It wasn't because of entitlements. It wasn't because we were helping little kids with their lunch programs. It was because those military boys who were always bitching about fiscal conservatism and tight budgets didn't give a goddamn about how much we were spending on the military. These were the days when military contractors were charging the United States $1,000 for a hammer plus 10% profit. Oh, this hammer costs us $1,000, and we get to charge you 10% more. So give me $1,100 because we got 10 hammers here. You know, that's $11,000. $11,000. And did they ever ask for an accounting? Did they ever ask that they have competitive bidding? No. These are whores. I don't care how they comport themselves as being fiscal conservatives. They're whores. The only reason they ever bitched about money was when the Democrats spent it. And I'm not saying the Democrats are noteworthy. The Democrats have a reputation of throwing money and walking away. They don't care how the money's spent, as long as they get their piece of the pie. Now, personally, I think it's better to feed people than create bombs. But both parties are responsible for what happened. By 1971, we didn't have the gold. We went off and we put paper money in. That's when inflation started happening. 10 years later, gold shot from 35, in 10 years, gold went from $35 an ounce to $850. That was a larger increase than the Dow going from in 1982, Reagan. 1982 went from a low of 777 up to 11,400 in the year 2000. That was a multiple of probably, I don't know, 1,700, 1,800% over 16 years, 18 years. Gold went from $35 to $850 in 9 years, which was a multiple of 2,400%. It left the Dow in the dust. In the dust. And the paper boys in Washington, D.C., the central bankers didn't like it. So what they did after that is they started shoving gold down, shoving gold down, shoving gold down. But they were vulnerable because their piece of paper, their money, was no longer anchored to anything of value. And this is what they've been fighting for 20 years. They've been fighting a rearguard action, trying to keep what's little left of that goose. That goose isn't functioning anymore. That goose is in pieces. We got a beak here, you got a wing over there, we got some feathers over here, and the place smells like a charnel house. That's what they're in. They are trying to hold this carcass together. And they're trying to keep you thinking, oh, it's all right. I should probably go and, you know, I could buy a house that was worth $600,000 2 years ago. I can now buy it for $400,000. I should do that. Go ahead and do it. That's what they want. Go ahead and do it. Go ahead and do all the things they want you to do. Go ahead and believe all the things they told you. Because you have. You have for 60 years. You've believed them, you've followed them, and now the country is on its last legs. And you're going to blame them? Go ahead. Blame them. Go ahead and blame them. But I suggest you look in the mirror. I suggest you look in the mirror. This is a democracy. You know? This is a democracy. And what they've done is that they got you pointing fingers at each other, at them, the left at the right at the left. They've got you running around like chickens in a farmyard, while the wolves are in there eating your young. Eating your young. And now that your young are massacred, you're wondering, what happened? Who let that wolf in? How did this happen to this great country? Well, it didn't happen by accident. It happened by design. And during that time, you weren't thinking, you weren't watching, you weren't doing anything except trying to make a living in a system that was going to squeeze every last bit from you. And as long as you thought you had a little left, you thought you were ahead of the game. I think it's sort of too late to wake you up. But we wake up anyway. Sometimes in the middle of a dream, sometimes in the middle of a nightmare. And I just hope that you have enough wherewithal and faith, spiritual faith, to get through the days ahead. Better days are coming. I believe this with a fullness of my heart. I have studied the purpose of life as deeply as I have studied the mechanisms of money, the origins of finance, and the history of capitalism, and the failings of the human race. But at the end of the day, at the end of this era, capitalism is going to fail. The United States is, if it ever rises up, it's going to be a different country than it has been. And it has to be. And I hope you realize that. Because if you don't, there is no hope.